I bring you a story that will freeze the blood in your veins. A story about a noble woman who turned her castle into a torture chamber, who kidnapped and murdered hundreds of young maidens in her obsessive quest for eternal youth. This is the story of Elizabeth Bathory, the Bloody Countess. In the misty Carpathian Mountains in the year 1560, a girl was born destined to become the most prolific serial killer in history. Elizabeth Bathory came into the world in the bosom of one of the most powerful families in Hungary. The Bathorys were known for their cruelty, power, and rumors of madness that ran through their veins. From childhood, Elizabeth showed disturbing signs. She grew up in an environment where violence was daily bread. She witnessed public executions as entertainment. She saw servants tortured for the slightest error. Blood and pain were her daily companions. At 15, she was married to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, known as the Black Knight of Hungary for his ferocity in battle. While her husband was at war, Elizabeth was left in charge of Countess Castle, and it was then that her true nature emerged in all its horrible glory. Everything began with an apparently trivial incident. One day, while a young servant was combing her hair, she accidentally pulled a strand. Elizabeth's fury was instantaneous and terrible. She struck the girl with such violence that blood splattered her face and hands. When she wiped the blood, Elizabeth believed she saw something extraordinary. Her skin seemed younger, more smooth where the blood had touched. This casual observation would become a monstrous obsession. Elizabeth began to believe that the blood of young maidens was the secret to eternal youth. And so began her reign of terror. The Countess developed an elaborate system to attract her victims. She established a supposed academy for noble young women, promising to teach them court etiquette and manners. Hundreds of lower nobility families, eager to give their daughters a refined education, sent their girls to the castle. Many never returned. But nobles were not her only victims. Peasant women also frequently disappeared. Her accomplices roamed nearby villages, seeking beautiful and healthy girls. Promises of well-paid work in the castle were impossible to resist for poor families. Once in the castle, the young women discovered the true horror awaiting them. The dungeons became torture chambers where Elizabeth, aided by her most loyal servants, carried out grotesque rituals. The tortures were as varied as they were horrible. Some girls were beaten until their bodies swelled, and then Elizabeth would bite them, tearing pieces of flesh with her teeth. Others were burned with red-hot irons or whipped until their skin came off in bloody strips. On the coldest nights, victims were taken naked to the castle courtyard, where water was thrown that froze instantly on their bodies. Elizabeth watched with delight as they slowly died, turned into ice statues. But her favorite method involved needles and pins. She would insert them under the girls' nails or insensitive body parts. The victims were tied up and pricked repeatedly while Elizabeth collected their blood in containers. It is said that the Countess bathed in her victims' blood, convinced this would keep her young forever. Other accounts speak of her drinking blood, believing she would absorb the young women's vitality by consuming it. One of her most loyal servants, Darvulia, a local witch, assured her that she would need the blood of 650 virgins to maintain her youth eternally. Elizabeth took this as a challenge and increased the frequency of her murders. Inhabitants of nearby towns began to suspect when more and more young women disappeared. Rumors about screams heard from the castle began to circulate. But nobody dared to confront the powerful Countess. Her tortures became increasingly elaborate. Elizabeth ordered the construction of a cage with inward-facing spikes, called the Iron Maiden. The victim was locked inside and the spikes slowly pierced her while the Countess bathed in the dripping blood. She also had a hanging cage with sharp blades inside. Girls were forced to enter, and then servants would swing it, causing the blades to slowly cut their flesh. But her sadism knew no limits. Sometimes she forced girls to cut their own flesh and eat it. Others were forced to lick blood from the floor while Elizabeth kicked them. During harsh winters, she would make her victims undress and spray them with cold water until they died frozen. Elizabeth's madness grew over the years. She was no longer content to torture her victims in the dungeons. She began performing her bloody rituals in her own chambers. The walls of her bedroom were stained with the blood of countless maidens. The end of her reign of terror came when she began to kidnap daughters of more powerful nobles. Noble families could tolerate the disappearance of peasant women, but when their own daughters started vanishing, the situation changed. Count Georgi Thurzo, by order of King Matthias II, conducted an investigation. What he found in Countess Castle surpassed his worst nightmares. When his men burst into the castle one December night in 1610, they found corpses everywhere. Some girls were still alive, bleeding and agonizing in the dungeons. The castle's register revealed rooms covered in dried blood. They found torture instruments, spiked cages, and the terrible diaries where Elizabeth meticulously documented her crimes. In them, she had noted the names of 650 victims. Elizabeth was arrested, but due to her noble lineage, she was not executed. Instead, she was walled up alive in her own room in Countess Castle. They only left a small opening to pass food and another for ventilation. She remained there for 4 years until her death in 1614. Her last days were spent in total darkness, surrounded by walls stained with her victims' blood. The exact number of her victims will never be known with certainty. Records speak of between 50 and 650 girls murdered, making her the most prolific serial killer in history. Today, Countess Castle remains in ruins, but locals say that on full moon nights, one can still hear the screams of tortured maidens. Some claim to have seen the figure of a woman dressed in black wandering the ruins, searching for more victims for her eternal bloodbath. Elizabeth Bathory's story reminds us that the most terrible monsters are not the vampires of legends, but human beings who, consumed by madness and power, are capable of unimaginable atrocities. Elizabeth Bathory's legacy goes beyond her immediate crimes. Historical records reveal additional details about her life and surrounding context. Her education was exceptional for a woman of her time. She spoke Hungarian, Latin, and Greek at a time when most nobles could barely read. This refined education dramatically contrasted with her cruel nature, which manifested from an early age. Documents from the period reveal that her family, the Bathorys, had a long history of disturbing behavior. Her uncle Stephen Bathory, who became King of Poland, was known for his violent outbursts. Her Aunt Clara was known for her promiscuity and cruelty towards servants. This family tendency towards violence and mental imbalance is well documented in nobility archives. Trial records, preserved in Hungarian archives, provide chilling testimonies from servants who participated in her crimes. Dorothea Sentes, known as Dorka Johannes Ujeri, and a woman named Ilona Jo were her main accomplices. Their testimonies under torture revealed the meticulous organization of the Countess's crimes. Thurzos investigations discovered that Elizabeth kept detailed records of her victims in a personal book. This book, presented as evidence in her trial, contained names and specific details of inflicted tortures. Historians who have studied these documents point out that her meticulousness suggests a level of premeditation and organization that makes her crimes even more disturbing. Judicial records also document the elaborate system she used to attract victims. Her position as a noblewoman allowed her to offer work in the castle to young peasant women, and her supposed manners academy attracted daughters of lower nobility. This use of her social position to facilitate her crimes demonstrates a level of calculated manipulation. The official investigation found evidence of systematic torture in various castle rooms. The discovered instruments included cages, shackles, and various torture implements, all catalogued in court records. Detailed descriptions of these instruments and their use are preserved in period judicial archives. The impact of her crimes on Hungarian society was profound and lasting. Records show that after her arrest, changes were implemented in laws regulating nobles' power over their serfs. Her case became a legal precedent that limited the absolute authority of nobility. The decision to wall her up alive instead of executing her was a complex political compromise. Period documents reveal negotiations between the Hungarian crown and the Bathory family. Her noble lineage saved her from execution, but her punishment had to be severe enough to satisfy the demand for justice. During her confinement, detailed records were kept of her daily routine. Guards documented every meal passed through the small opening, every request she made, and any words she spoke. These records, preserved in historical archives, show that she maintained her arrogance to the end, never showing remorse for her actions. After her death in 1614, an exhaustive inventory was made of her possessions and properties. Documents from this inventory, still preserved, reveal the immense wealth she had accumulated and how this wealth had allowed her to operate with impunity for so long. Countess Castle, after her death, went through several owners, each change documented in property records of the time. The fortress gradually fell into disuse and deterioration, a process documented in administrative records and letters of the period. Modern historians who have studied her case point out that it represents a unique example of systematic historical documentation of violence against women in late medieval Europe. Her crimes, meticulously recorded, provide a window into the darkest aspects of feudal society and power abuse by nobility. The Bathory case continues to be studied by historians and legal experts as an early example of systematic criminal investigation. The methods used to document her crimes and the legal procedures employed in her trial set important precedents in Hungarian legal history. If you want to learn more stories about the true monsters that inhabited European castles, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Because sometimes reality is darker than any legend, and true vampires don't need supernatural fangs to drink their victims' blood. Subscribe if you liked the video, give it a like and don't forget to leave your comment.